KTM 790 Adventure R is probably the best adventure bike in the world right now. Welcome to our review. The KTM 790 Adventure is a bike that's been a long time coming. It was launched to the public in Morocco earlier this year, and when it finally came out, it was a pretty serious looking thing. For a start, this was the first adventure bike in a really long time where the scales had gone down instead of up. Since then, Yamaha have matched them, but the numbers that KTM had set themselves to achieve were pretty damn high. The Austrian brand started the platform off with the 790 engine. That's the same engine that's found in the 790 Duke, and it's an engine that won a lot of praise when it first came out. KTM have detuned it slightly, so it's around 94 horsepower, and they've added some other really big numbers on paper. It's got 240 millimeters of suspension, 20 liters of fuel, so the distance should be good, and it's around 205 kilos. On top of that, the KTM is also fitted out with all of the electronics. It starts off with a TFT screen, which is controlled from the left-hand switchgear. Then on top of that, we've got electronic throttle, ABS, traction control, and quite uniquely, a dialable traction control system that has a scale from 1 to 10. It's something that you see on a lot of sports bikes, but we've never had it on an adventure bike before. KTMs have had a really unique character for a long time. They're bikes that feel really alive, they're intense, they're exciting, and sometimes a little bit overwhelming. The KTM 1090 Adventure was like that, the 1190 Adventure was like that, and the 790 Adventure R massively bucks that trend. On road, the bike is a dream. If you never took this bike off-road, you'd still have a really great ownership experience. It's really fun to ride. It's worth noting that the bike comes fitted with Karoo 3s, that's the OEM tire, and that's how we tested it, and that will definitely affect the handling. However, all in, it's a really easy, effortless, enjoyable, and consistent bike to ride on the road. Despite having a 21-inch, 18-inch wheel combo, the bike feels incredibly planted and comfortable on the road. It feels like it's got infinitely more grip than it should have, and it makes it a really enjoyable, confidence-inspiring ride. The whole time I was on the bike, I felt like I could just keep pushing and pushing, and it was kind of just gonna hold. It gave really pleasant feedback. I felt really comfortable on it from the get-go, and it's probably the most comfortable I've felt on a bike that quickly in a really long time. Getting the bike to turn into corners was also a really balanced experience. This isn't a bike that's full-blown street bike where you really need to counter steer the bike to get it to turn in, and it's not the other way where it's a super flighty kind of feeling wide handlebarred adventure bike where if you touch the handlebars it drops over. It sits somewhere in the middle, so you need a little bit of input, a little bit of counter steering to get it turning, but it's not a lot of effort. And when you do it, it rolls over really nicely. It doesn't tip into corners too quickly. It holds its line brilliantly, and it just generally feels really good. A lot of that confidence comes from the suspension. The suspension on the 790 is, I think, currently unlike anything else that's in production in the adventure space. It's fantastically balanced, it's very settled, it doesn't wallow, even though it's got a huge amount of travel. It's 240 millimeters, which means that there's a lot of travel there to play with. And while it does have some dive in the first part of the stroke, from the mid-stroke onwards, it's very controlled. So when you brake hard, you get to the middle of the stroke, and the bike sits there, and it sits there and stays there poised and lets you tip into the corner, and it doesn't bounce back with any aggression, so you end up with a really settled feeling bike. It lets you ride quite quickly on the road considering how long the suspension is, and it makes the riding experience very consistent. You know, everything you do happens the same again and again and again, and I think that also breeds confidence really quickly because it's predictable. Where the 790 for me was extra surprising is how comfortable it was at not riding fast. This isn't something that I think a lot of KTM models have been especially good at. You know, looking back at their past of the 1190R and the 1090R, those bikes were great if you were happy to ride like a hooligan. And the 790R isn't like that. It's happy if you're not that person. It's happy for you to be mellow and for you to have a chilled out ride and cruise around. And it's happy for you to not do that and push hard and go for a bit of a weekend warrior vibe. That's something I think is really brilliant. It translates into its capacity to kind of do other types of riding. So if you're a commuter or you ride in town, I think the bike's actually one of the best that KTM have made in a really long time. It's very comfortable at low RPM. It's really comfortable in quite big gears. So you can kind of cruise around at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM, and it's nowhere near as lumpy as KTM's have been in the past. It's not the smoothest bike in the class, but it's also way better than they have been, and now kind of a bike that ends up with a much more rounded road bike profile. That translates into its highway riding as well. It's comfortable at speed. It's just happy to sit there in top gear at 75, 80 miles an hour and never feel like it's working because it's got bags and bags of power. The fueling really helps with that road riding at slow speed. The roll on from zero throttle is much, much smoother than a lot of other bikes have been since the Euro 4 regulations came in. Opening the throttle has no jerk, no lurch. It's just nice and smooth all the way through, especially in the standard street mode. On the street, the 790R is one of those bikes that it actually does everything really, really well. It's a bike that I'd quite happily live with on a day-to-day basis without ever feeling like I was compromising anything. And I think that's a brilliant trait for an adventure bike to have. Most people who are looking at buying a KTM 790 Adventure R are looking at it for its off-road capability, and you should be. It's really, really good, but what it isn't is perfect. Let's start with the things that it does really well. The highlight of the 790R is without a doubt the chassis as a whole. So we're talking the suspension and the handling combined. I think the thing that really struck me with this bike is that the ceiling of it, the upper limit of what it can do speed-wise and what it can take as a whole is really, really, really high. It's high to the point that I never found the ceiling of it. I never felt like I've reached the limit of this bike. It doesn't really want to go any faster without me kind of having to ride around problems. And the ceiling feels high enough that I don't really know where it is. I didn't find it. I don't want to find it, because if I'm finding it, I'm probably going faster than I'm comfortable on a 200 kilo bike. The suspension is literally brilliant. I think the poise of the 790R can be broken down into a few component parts. The first is the balance and the center of gravity. The design of the fuel tanks and the general design of the bike means the center of gravity is quite low for such a tall bike. Think of the same way that a 1250 GS, even though it's quite a heavy bike, has a super low center of gravity because half the engine sticks out the side instead of going upwards. It's the same principle, keep the weight low and your center of gravity will be low. And the combination of the balanced suspension and the chassis mean that the balance between the foot pegs left and right, the way the bike sits upright is really, really nice. It just wants to stay upright. When you're riding stood up, it doesn't weave left and right in any way. And that means it's really easy to put on a spot. When you want to hit a rut, it's easy. When you want to be slow and controlled between some obstacles, it's easy. And that makes it a nice bike to ride. Next up on that list is the suspension. The suspension is overall the best adventure bike suspension I've ever ridden. It is unbelievable. What makes it special is how controlled it is. The initial part of the stroke is really nice off-road. It's very plush and it deals with short, sharp hits nicely. So rocks and roots and little holes. It deals with really comfortably. It's not harsh in any way. But when you hit something a little bit bigger, or if you hit a few bumps in a row, you catch the mid-stroke, and the mid-stroke all the way through to the bottom of the suspension is phenomenally controlled. It really, really quickly ramps up the amount of damping in it so that you don't blow through the stroke. So you're never having a metal-to-metal hit. You're never feeling like the forks are diving when they shouldn't or disappearing through the stroke. And really quickly, you end up in a confident place where you trust that the bike is not going to let you down. I actually found it quite difficult to get comfortable with this because it's not how I'm used to adventure bikes handling. You're kind of much more used to them having suspension issues that you're trying to ride around or you're expecting them to do, and it just doesn't happen on this bike. Along those same lines, you can hit things really hard, too hard, like harder than you ever want to hit anything on an adventure bike. But I think what I really like about that for a genuine adventure bike, a bike you're genuinely going to travel on, is that occasionally you're going to make mistakes. And while I wouldn't necessarily want to ride an adventure bike that hard a lot, the fact that you can get away with making a mistake because the suspension can deal with it and it can take a lot of abuse is really, really comforting. It means if you are riding a gravel road at 60 kilometers an hour or 100 k's an hour or whatever, and you suddenly hit a hole, that bike is going to deal with it in a way that I think no other adventure bike can. And that's awesome. The third part of this that works really well is the weight. The weight is low on the bike and the number of weight is actually really low as well. It's not often that you're riding with the tanks full, so generally you're riding a bike that's less than 200 kilos. It's only every now and then when you absolutely bring the tank that you're up around that 205 mark. And generally that, I think, makes a huge difference to how the bike works. When you combine that with the ergonomics, which are very off-road friendly, it's a slim bike, the riding position is really good, especially if you're coming from riding dirt bikes, it feels very similar. It works really well. I think if you're a little bit taller or you've come from a different adventure bike and you're used to a more upright riding position, say like a GS or something like that where the bars are a little bit higher, you might want to rise, but otherwise it's really nice. All of that together makes for a really settled, controlled, predictable, enjoyable ride. And there's one last key to the puzzle in the handling off-road that I don't really understand how they've done this or what causes it, but the 790R has incredible grip, especially on the front end. It feels like it has more grip than other bikes. I've ridden plenty of bikes on Karoo 3s over the years in plenty of different scenarios, and especially on our testing ground that we use the same for every bike. And this literally felt better. It felt like I had more grip, it was more planted, I had more confidence, I had lots of confidence on the side of the tire, on off cambers, on gravelly tracks. I just felt like this bike had more grip and handled better than everything else that I've ridden in the same place. It's safe to say, off-road, the KTM 790R handles brilliantly. The engine department is a little bit more confused. We have two modes for off-road riding, so off-road and rally mode, and within that you have two different throttle responses. You have an off-road throttle response and a rally throttle response. So as far as I'm aware, off-road is the same between the two modes. Off-road throttle response is a blanket thing, that's what it feels like. And then in rally mode you have this extra throttle response, which is a little bit stronger. It is raspy, it is aggressive, it is powerful, and the 790 engine wants to go. It is not a mode to be gentle in, it is not a mode that likes to go slow. This is for when you've got big open trails and you want to go fast and do power slides and generally be a little bit of a hooligan. And if you're in that environment, it's brilliant. It's really, really good fun. However, in the UK, we have a lot of riding that's way more technical than that, way slower and quite a lot slipperier. And where the rally mode kind of gets let down a little bit is the bottom end is almost impossible to ride with. It's really, really, really aggressive from zero throttle. So immediately the rear wheel wants to spin, and that makes it difficult to ride. So when you switch it to off-road mode, it gets better, it gets smoother and much gentler, and it's easier to feel the grip and pull away in difficult scenarios and be gentle on hills and on slippery tracks. But the off-road mode is a little bit confused. Where they've flattened it out and given you some bottom end, the mid-range feels a bit flat. It feels like I want the bottom end of off-road mode with the mid-range and the top end of rally mode, so that if I want to be gentle, I can be gentle, but if I want to do wheelies and have fun and skip holes and so on, I can do that. And in off-road mode, that's a little bit harder than I want it to be. My biggest complaint about the whole package is that the throttle and the engine and the rear wheel don't feel very well connected. It's an electronic throttle, and the modes definitely change the actual throttle response as much as they change the mapping. So in rally mode, What I do in my right hand from the bottom of the power feels like it's way more intense. And when I change it to off-road mode, what happens with my right hand feels really labored. It feels like there's a delay in my hand, and you do get used to it. You learn to ride around it pretty quickly, but it is there, and I kind of wish it wasn't. The last point of note that really impressed me with the 790R is its manageability. It is a tall bike, it has quite a tall seat height, a lot of suspension, but despite this, it feels very comfortable in slow speed environments. So getting on and off if you've got to open gates, or you're in the car park and you need to turn around, or you're turning on a difficult trail, it doesn't have a lot of weight throw. So if the balance changes on the bike because you've moved it, it doesn't overthrow you, it doesn't wallow around, the suspension is very settled, and overall that creates a package that's very nice to live with. While the 790R is an incredible bike to ride, it is not without its frustrating little bits. First on that list is the fuel gauge. I think the fuel gauge is based in the right-hand side of the fuel tank, so when you put the bike on the side stand, it loses all sense of how much fuel you've got and consistently tells you that you're empty. On top of that, the fuel gauge only reads from half down, so you also never know how much fuel you've got until you've got half a tank, and then you've put your bike on the side stand and it tells you you've got no fuel. It's a little thing, but on a day-to-day basis, it drove me crazy. I just wanted to know how much fuel I had, and I never did. Second on my list of annoying things is the KTM's desire to reset the safety functions. So consistently, it resets the ABS and the traction control to being on if you've turned them off. Now, for the most part, this isn't an issue because when you ride on the street, I just leave the modes on. You don't need to turn them off. They're very unintrusive, and the limit of where they're set is very high, so you can ride quite quickly without ever noticing them. However, when you ride off-road, I found the traction control sometimes to be a little bit intrusive, and I enjoyed riding more without it, but whenever I stopped and turned the bike off, it turns back on. You forget, you ride off, you have to stop again to turn it on because it's kind of complicated to do on the fly while riding off-road. And when I say turn the bike off, I don't just mean to turn the key off. When you do that, it resets. But if you turn the kill switch off, it resets. And I might be wrong about this, but it seems like it resets if you sit still with the engine off for an extended period of time as well. It's frustrating. I believe KTM have a solution for this that you can pay for, and 100% I would pay for that. In general, I think the lower tank protection and the sump guard being integrated is a really, really cool idea. I love the fact that you probably don't need crash bars with this bike. You don't need to add any weight to it, because the plastic protection around the tank is really strong. We've used that kind of plastic protection as sump guards on dirt bikes for years, and it's really effective. I've never broken one, I've never punctured one, I've never punctured a case since I've been using one. It's generally a really, really strong system. However, the metal guard between it seems a little bit thin. Our one had a few dents in it that I don't know if it was caused by us or someone else, but it definitely already took some damage, and I think it could be stronger. If you're not smashing your bike into rocks all the time and you're careful with it, you're probably never going to have a problem, but I definitely think that could be a little bit stronger than it is. The next point on the list is the brakes. They're pretty interesting because they're set up very much for off-road bias. That means they're very progressive and they take a little bit longer to bite than you would expect. They still work well, they're still strong enough on the road, but you definitely need more of a lever pull than you would on a normal road bike. However, off-road, this kind of comes into its own because it's a bit more balanced. You've got a little bit more feel and a little bit more play before you reach the really powerful part of the brake. They still work well, just don't get on it and expect them to blow your mind, because they definitely won't. Last on my list of gripes and problems with this bike are the heated grip switch and the mirrors. This is a bike that's just a few pounds short of 12,000 pounds. And it feels like those are two little things where they really cut corners. This might seem nitpicky, but I think if I'd paid 12,000 pounds for a bike, you want it to feel really complete, and those two items don't. They feel like the mirrors came from one of their cheaper bikes, a 690 or something, and the heated grip switch looks like it came off Alibaba. It's a really cheap unit. It does the job, they both do the job well, but just the finish isn't there. All in, KTM 790 Adventure R really caught me off guard. I was expecting something that was probably pretty good, and all the other reviews that exist suggested it would be, but this bike is a phenomenally handling bike. I've got no issue in saying that at the moment, I think this is probably the best suspended adventure bike on the planet, and probably the best handling as well. As well as being a super, super good off-road based adventure bike, it doesn't feel like they've compromised that much on the road handling. It handles great, it's a very rounded package and it works well on the highway, it's got good wind protection, it's comfortable, it's really roomy cockpit so you can move around if you're spending a long time in the saddle. And in general, that's a really complete package. I think this is easily KTM's most rounded adventure bike ever, and probably the most rounded adventure bike that's been built in a long, long time. It's a fun bike, it rides super well off-road, it rides super well on-road, and I think it fits a much broader spectrum of bike than KTM's typically have. It's now the A-class bike in its class. It is the bike that all bikes coming out should be benchmarked against, and generally is a brilliant motorcycle. The only real challenge you're gonna have with this bike are the relatively tall seat height that comes with a lot of suspension and the few small niggles that it has. Whether those take away from the fact that it's nearly 12,000 pounds is a pretty personal thing. It isn't a cheap bike, but on the whole, there's a huge amount of technology and design built into it. I think its current biggest competitor is the Tenere 700, which is significantly cheaper, but you lose out on a lot of tech and assistance. Whether that adds up to the KTM being the right bike or not for you is entirely personal, but if you did purchase this bike, I think you're gonna have a really great ownership experience. It is an awesome bike all round. Thanks for watching our review. If you like this video, we have plenty more reviews and how-tos and so on coming out all the time, so hit the subscribe button, give us a like. If you've got any questions, throw them down in the comments. And lastly, we want to talk to you about Patreon. Patreon is our way of funding Brake Magazine as a whole. It's essentially an optional subscription service where you can help us to continue to create the content we make. We've got two levels, one which is an entry level, $5 a month, and a second tier which offers a few exclusive things. Those include a monthly Q&A session where we can answer your questions to do with bikes and riding and whatever you want to ask, and a video series called Dialed In, where we take the bikes that we've tested and we provide a chunk more detail. If you want to know more about that, click on the button at the end of this video, which is the Patreon logo, or check out the link in the description below. And thanks very much for watching. It is not without its shortcomings. I've forgotten what they are. Okay, fuel gauge.